Well, I'm happy that I'm here today being able to talk to some folks. I haven't done a lot of this in the last several years, so this may be rusty and painful for you guys, so I apologize in advance. My name is Fritton. I work for the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska. I'm the Water and Agriculture Program Manager for the Nebraska chapter of the Nature Conservancy. So a lot of what I do in my position is work on implementing our agriculture projects across the state. So working with farmers, working with local partners, working with vendors, university, on working with producers to get adoption of conservation practices across the state. I've been in this position for a little over 8 years now. Prior to working for the Nature Conservancy, I was working for Monsanto out at the Gothenburg Water Utilization Learning Center. So I was doing demonstration and research, kind of a focus on helping High Plains farmers grow more, using less inputs. My education's actually in wildlife biology. So for over a decade now, kind of worked in that gap in between conservation and agriculture. So here today to tell you, I guess, a little bit about the Nature Conservancy, why ag is so important to our work, kind of how we approach our work with agriculture, and then talk a little bit about some projects we've done and some projects that we got going on, some opportunities that we got going on currently. So I'll say that I'm not a huge fan of presenting. I like conversations about more than presenting, so feel free to interrupt, feel free to fall asleep, feel free to do whatever you wish there. But I do like conversations and questions, so don't be afraid to butt in and ask questions or something, whatever needs to be done there. So usually I'm already having to walk back and forth to click through slides. Usually I start off with who is the Nature Conservancy. So how many of you have heard of the Nature Conservancy before? That's a couple more than I usually get. So pretty much nobody raises their hands. I was the same way before I worked for the Nature Conservancy. I was pretty unfamiliar with the organization. The Nature Conservancy is actually the world's largest nonprofit conservation organization. We're active in all 50 states and 70 countries around the world. Our mission is to conserve the land and waters on which all life depends. Historically, most of our work has been operating primarily as a land trust. So we have ground that's either donated to us or we acquire and then protected in its natural beauty. So examples of that, this is a map of Nebraska up here. Each one of those little pin drops is ground in Nebraska that the Nature Conservancy has been involved in preserving through the years. Two of our biggest complexes are what we call our Platte River Prairies. We have about several thousand acres along the Platte River over by Wood River that we maintain as native habitat. And then up along the Niobrara and the Sand Hills, we have a 60,000 acre ranch. If you've ever gone up and tubed down the Niobrara, a lot of that stretch that we tube is through Nature Conservancy ground. And so, like I said, we've historically operated, where we focused a lot on our ground and maintaining it in kind of its natural state. But being a global organization, especially over the last couple of decades, our goals have really shifted. And so instead of just being focused on protecting land and water, we started to have goals like providing food and water sustainably, tackling climate change. And those are system, large-scale type goals that really had forced the Nature Conservancy to look beyond our own fence line to do conservation and really, forced us to go out and work with private landowners. We have all these dots that are on that map are really just little islands in the oceans of private owned ground that's used primarily for farming and ranching. So getting conservation done at scale really, and having focus on things like food and water and climate change has really forced us to go out and work with private landowners.
where you work with private landowners in addition to what property you own or manage?
Yeah, we still do all of our own our stuff on our own ground. We try to use what we learn there to influence others as well. Like for instance, our Niagara, what we call our Niagara Valley Preserve, that range that's up in the Sand Hills. We do a lot of outreach there with Sand Hills ranchers on kind of managing their ranch for biodiversity of species and trying to cross that their ranching system with creating as much ecological benefits that have benefits for the producer and maintaining the ground as well as the conservation for keeping them kind of in the natural state. So it's still a big part of what we do, but having that global scale has really kind of pushed us to have to work with landowners if we want to have impacts on the overall system. And ag really is a key player in that regard. We want to be involved working with ag for one reason. For that reason, I just pointed out, Nebraska's 97% private owned, and so anything you're going to get done at scale is going to be, working with those landowners, trying to drive that system scale sort of stuff. So, not much that we can do from a scale perspective on even on our thousands of acres that we own. That impact doesn't go too much beyond our own fence line. So you look at like water quantity in the state. Ag is a big driver of a lot of these things. We're the number one irrigated state in the nation. We've got this extensive water development. That water development in the state's really changed the way that water moves across the state, where it's at. We got competing needs. From a conservation standpoint, we like to see water in the rivers, maintain habitat. Ag, obviously the lifeblood of Nebraska and our economy, and irrigation really drives that, so it's extremely important that ag gets the water that they need to be able to produce. Water used for energy, water for municipal supply. And so, within that system, with ag being such a big driver, there's a lot of potential there for farmers to provide a lot of benefit. The better that they can manage their irrigation, the more flexibility there's going to be within the system to adapt to water challenges in the future. You look at water quality issues in the state. How a farmer manages their irrigation, how they manage their fertility, how they manage their soil all impact what they're keeping on their field versus what's leaving their field site. And so we end up with sediment and nutrients in our surface water source, which ends up going into the Mississippi River Basin and contributing to both hypoxia. Probably more of a concern here locally is we have leaching of nitrates into our groundwater supply. So this map on the bottom left there, every little orange dot and red dot is a well here in the state that exceeds the limit for safety on nitrates. And so there again, field level management by farmers has a big impact and can have a big impact on conservation around water quality as well. Then you look at climate, and agriculture is really both a driver and a victim of climate change. 50% of the Earth's habitable surface and 70% of its water use is for agriculture. And globally, agriculture emits about a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions. Here in the United States, it's about 10 to 12%. So a big driver, also a victim. Annually, climate-related disasters cost about $10 billion annually in the United States. Agriculture also can be a big part of the solution. It's estimated that by 2050, regenerative agriculture could reduce emissions by about 23 gigatons, which is about, we did some math on this, about 14% reduction in overall emissions by just making some changes to the practices that are being done on the ground. So ag, really important from conservation from a lot of different angles. One thing that's not listed up in here as well too is that, as a conservation organization, the Nature Conservancy looks a lot at land conversion and wanting to avoid land conversion if possible. And as you all know, we got growing population and this challenge to feed the world. And conservation really needs agriculture to be, increase its productivity on the existing ground in order to be able to feed that world without having to, put a threat to converting more ground to agriculture to meet that need. So all around, it's just, if you want to do conservation, at scale, it means working with landowners, it means working with farmers, it means working with ranchers. Can provide a lot of benefit. Already do a lot of great things and can provide a lot of benefit to the system as a whole.
So what portion of agriculture do you feel that the majority of those greenhouse gases come from?
Flora, I guess I could introduce this, a good opportunity to introduce Flora here. Flora is my colleague. She comes from Argentina and has been working with the nation since a year now. She has a lot more expertise, especially in the climate space, and understanding this piece, so she might have a better answer. But from within, do you remember what we saw in that graph from within agriculture, where it specifically comes from? Fertilizer is a big part of it, for sure. I have to look. I don't know that we specifically point one individual as one individual practice.
No, I mean, you have obviously like nitrous oxide, for example, is a huge GHG. It's a greenhouse gas that's like 300 times more potent than CO2. Everybody mentions and talks about it. That comes mainly from like overuse of nitrogen, so obviously a bunch of that nitrogen is going to go in groundwater, the aquifer, but a lot of it is going to go into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which is N2O, and then you have a lot of methane coming from cattle, guys, that's a huge emitter. And then when with tillage, for example, and when you leave the ground bare for a long time, you have a bunch of CO2 emissions because you don't have it covered, and then the biota in the ground is breathing and it's emitting a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere, carbon dioxide. So those are like the main sources of emissions when it comes to agriculture. And when it comes to nitrous oxide, actually, so agriculture is the main, like globally, when you take a look at all the nitrous oxide emissions from all the sources in the world, agriculture is the main driver of that one, for example. So focusing on nitrous oxide, that's huge. And that's nitrogen management.
Where's the nitrous oxide come from?
So you have the nitrogen on the ground, and then you have specific processes going on under the ground, so in the soil, which, anyways, is like microbiology going out there, and that's just like how the nitrous oxide is put together on the ground, and it's just like goes out into the atmosphere.
Mostly over application of nitrogen, and then there's also a role that's played by irrigation as well too, and like how handling the environment leads to more nitrous oxide that comes off of those spaces.
So if the fertilizer is placed in the soil under, continues to leak from the surface, then you're not going to have that issue, right?
No, we still have it.
Still have that.
Yeah. As long as the nitrogen is tucked there, let's say, I mean, it's either going to leach or the microbiology there is going to process it in different ways. And actually, when you have like nitrogen being processed into nitrogen, so ammonia or whatever, there's a lot of like that creation of nitrous oxide going out into the atmosphere. So in the atmosphere, you have like nitrogen as N2, which is inert, it doesn't do anything, but then when it comes straight from those specific processes, that's when it has that greenhouse effect. But as long as it's on the ground, it's going to be available for the microbiology there to do its thing.
I think it's natural part of what goes on. It's just that more of it is emitted when there's excess fertilizer.
So if they're on the correct amount and the crop uses it,
There's a lot less that comes off.
It's less nitrogen available for those kind of processes.
Or you can capture it with cover crop or something like that.
But,
Yeah.
yes, for sure, cover crops are very
For sure.
Is there a number that, for like, because if you have like a field of corn, you've got 5 million plants, things like a quarter. Is there a number that how much oxygen the plant or the field gives off? Because it's taking in carbon dioxide, right, and giving more oxygen. Is there a number?
I'm sure there is. I don't have that expertise in those I'm sure that they've looked at, you know, necessarily not like the plant level, but I'm sure that they've looked at it at the acre or off of that particular field connection sort of situation. There's a lot of information that you can find out even through scientific papers on kind of the different portions and where you come from and how much is contributed by irrigation practices. There's a lot to learn about this. Great questions, though. Appreciate them for sure. So I was kind of wrapping up, you know, why ag was important to the Nature Conservancy. A little bit about our approach to how we work with farmers, how we work with ag. Our approach is really kind of rooted in this acknowledgement that we're not farmers, and so we really need to lean into farmers for guidance on you know, what challenges they're facing, what tools they can use, you know, how they may or may not benefit their operation. And so we really lean into producers, try to find, you know, tools they're interested in trying out or potentially using, recognizing that there's usually a risk for adopting those practices or implementing those new practices, making changes, and try to provide a low-risk opportunity to try out those practices, usually through the form of, you know, financial assistance and technical assistance in implementing practices. Work hand in hand with the producers to evaluate benefits both to the producers and to conservation. In general, we look for those win-win practices where farmers will do them because they benefit their bottom line or they benefit the quality of life, and that they also just happen to have conservation outcomes that come out of it. And then on the back end of things, try to take, you know, what we learn from our practice or learn from our projects and what we learn from working with farmers, and then try to share that information and help drive scale of adoption of those sorts of practices. And for that, we really lean into our partners, lean into folks like NRDs, NRCS, university, folks that just have a larger reach than the Nature Conservancy as an organization within the ag community. So examples, kind of how we put this work into play, starts with our first ag project. This is the first time that TNC here in Nebraska had dipped their toe into working with agriculture. It was we called our Western Nebraska Irrigation project. I was hired on to coordinate this project 8 years ago. The Western Nebraska Irrigation project was funded primarily by Coca-Cola as part of what they called their Replenish program. Basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to go into the communities that they affect and the supply chain and fund water projects to generate a water benefit equal to the amount of water that they use in the production of their goods. And they really wanted to, they reached out to Nebraska, they wanted to work here in Nebraska, they wanted to work on corn and water, which makes sense because you flip on the it's water and corn, so it's pretty much all that's in there. And so we put together this project. We worked out in Western Nebraska, started in 2014, worked in the South Platte River Valley in between Ogallala and the state line in Colorado. We worked there for 3 years with 11 farmers on about 8,000 acres. And what we did is went out and set up a cost share program where we would pay half the cost of irrigation technologies for the producers that work with us. So we covered half the cost of pivot telemetry, EC field mapping, soil moisture probes, development of variable rate irrigation prescriptions, and then we also put a network of weather stations across the valley so that they had field level weather information. And so we did that, like I said, it was about 60 pivots, or about 8,000 acres with 11 producers for 3 years. When we concluded that project, we started up our Central Nebraska Irrigation project. This project is funded by Cargill and Nestle Purina. Their motivation behind this project, or investing in this project, Nestle Purina makes dog food, they use a bunch of beef products. They get those beef products through Cargill, and both those companies recognize that A big part of the footprint of that beef production was the feed, corn feed being grown for beef. And so they liked how we were working with corn and with water, and funded this project working with the Central Platte Natural Resource District. Project took place basically kind of in the Kearney and Grand Island area. And we worked with 50 farmers over 5 years. This project is still going on. We'll go through next growing season on about 7,000 acres. Help support some staff time at the NRD for coordinating the project with us. Essentially what we did, we took a little bit different approach with our incentives on this project though. In the first project we did a 50-50 split, and we let farmers enroll as many acres as they wanted to. With this one we wanted to engage more producers, and took 3 basic water tools and worked with each producer on one field. But we paid the full cost of a flow meter with telemetry, basically so they knew how much water they were using, a weather station at their field so they knew how much it had rained, and they knew how much evapotranspiration was occurring, and then pivot telemetry so that they had the flexibility to actually be able to act upon that information. And so we gave them those 3 tools, plus we had a cost share program for soil moisture probes where they could get basically $3,000 towards the soil moisture probe use over 3 years. And so we worked with 50 farmers. Thought behind that was give them a chance to try these tools out on one field with the hope that they spread that out across the rest of their operation. After having a chance to try it without having to take the risk of making the investment into it. So what did we learn through our 2 irrigation projects? From a water use standpoint on both projects, we worked with Dr. Critten from the University of Nebraska. He took kind of various scientific approaches to both the projects, but essentially using all the data from the NRDs and from the project itself. What we've seen from a water use standpoint is pretty consistently about 15% less water use for the farmers that are using the technologies versus the ones that haven't. It's been very consistent, like I said, with the exception of 2019 when it flooded and we got boatloads of rain and nobody really irrigated at all. We didn't see much benefit. But in general, what we're seeing is that when they have the technology and they got better information to make their decisions, they end up turning their pivot a couple less times each year. So we've seen that that's that conservation win that we've gotten from our projects. But probably the more important piece is the farmer feedback and how the tools were working for the farmers. And so the first proof point was at the end of our Western Nebraska irrigation project when I sat down with those farmers and said, we're not going to foot the bill on this anymore. Are you guys going to keep this? Are you going to shut it all off? And everybody who was involved kept at least one tool on their operation. Most all of them had expanded the tools across their operation as well too. And so, that was really kind of the proof in the pudding for us that, that when they had to pay for it on their own, they saw enough value in it to continue investing into those tools. Now, why they invested into those and why they kept those tools, they really didn't care about the water reduction. I mean, it affects their bottom line to some degree. They're using a little bit less energy to pump that water. But really, the feedback we got from farmers on why they kept these tools was really focused on 2 things. One, saving time and labor. Having the ability to run your pivots from your phone, not have someone crew out to drive around, being aware of what's going on across your operation, and be able to quickly, go fix a pivot if something's going wrong. So that time and labor savings they felt was a much bigger positive impact on the bottom line. The other thing was just general peace of mind and quality of life. Being aware of what was going on across their operation was really impactful for them. And then just improving their quality of life. A lot of guys that would tell us about how they, go to their son's football game on Friday night and be able to pull up the pivots and shut them off if they would know who to call, that they need to call somebody up and send them out to whichever field because they were having an issue there. So, but in either case, you know, we considered it a win-win because we saw that that these technologies were having a positive impact on their water management, and that farmers were looking at these tools and seeing them as something that were a value add to their operation as a whole. Any questions or comments? Okay. So, along with doing work in irrigation, we really have always kind of had our eyes on doing work with soil health as well too. Our first project that we did around soil health, called our Upper Big Blue Soil Health Project, but we almost always refer to it as the interseeding project. And you know, you guys all probably know one of the common things that we hear from farmers when we ask them about adopting cover crops is that it's challenging in Nebraska in a system that's, you know, primarily corn. Trying to plant cover crops at the end of the season when you're busy with harvest and all the other things that are going on during that window, you have very limited time and labor resources to put towards going out and planting a cover crop. Even when you do get out there and plant a cover crop, that's really late in the season, and so there's a pretty small window for being able to get growth, and so it's probably not as productive as it could be. And so interseeding is a practice that could potentially give another opportunity, another window for getting out and planting cover crops during the season. And so essentially what we do, interseeding is going out in about the early June timeframe when the crops are about V4 or so, and using this kind of specialized drill that essentially is able to, it's got row units missing from where the cash crop is, so that you can go out and you can plant the cover crop before the canopy closes. And then that gives a little bit of a window there after you've planted the cover crops for them to germinate, start to grow, but then the canopy closes over and they kind of sit there dormant through most of the season. But then late in the season, when it works out right, you end up with something like this. This is actually a field from the project from this last fall. But as the corn senesces and light starts to come through, the cover crop's already there, it starts to take off. You harvest your crop, the cover crop's already there, it's ready to go. So I think it's an opportunity, at least, you know, like I said, another window that might be there for farmers to get out and potentially get cover crops into their field or into their operation. This project, the funding for the project came from Kellogg's and from the Nebraska Environmental Trust. And what we did is we bought the interseeding drill. We pay for the cover crop seed for the farmers that we work with. We also pay per acre this financial incentive for being involved in the project. We also provide the equipment and labor for planting the cover crop. So Dan here at the Upper Big Blue and Nelson, who works for the Nature Conservancy, every June they load up the tractor and the drill, and they drive out and plant these interseeded cover crops for these farmers that we're working with. We work with UNL Extension with Steve Melvin and Jenny Reese.
You guys pay for fuel as well?
Yeah, we it's our tractor. Yeah, we just show up. We literally load the tractor and work with the producer on the logistics of when their field is going to be ready to go and where they want the cover crops to be planted. But then we show up and we pay for the gas. We have the tractor. They don't stop their operation.
So what's the reason for the
not to participate in. I don't know. We have pretty limited capacity on how much we can handle this project. Like with this project, we're working with 11 producers and nobody's planted over 10 acres. We have essentially about a 2-week window, maybe, and we got to get around to all these fields and plant them. From involvement, pretty no-brainer. Everything's free, right? Free seed, free labor. We We even pay them $50 per acre for being involved. The other piece that I was starting to say is that it's, we work with Human Extension and Steve Melvin and Jenny Reese, and so these farms are also part of the on-farm research network, so they're set up with strip trials and soil samples and biomass samples and try to provide feedback to producers on how this may be providing benefit. So pretty easy sell for farmers for being involved. If there was a reason not to do it, it's also the reason that we're primarily doing this project, and that is trying to figure out if there's any pitfalls to doing this, if it has some sort of like negative impact. Like we're looking at those things like biomass and soil health properties and looking at those benefits, but really it's mostly about, do you plant this cover crop and create some sort of disaster? We had cowpeas in the mix the first year, they vine up the corn plant. We had a field that got a little bit of hail damage, and so we opened up the canopy early, and the cowpeas took off. And so when they harvested, they were kind of able to do all of this extra growth that's out there. Making sure that we're not causing any sort of real significant issues by putting it out there, it ends up competing and dragging down yield. So that probably would be the biggest drawback, is that it's risky from the standpoint that could mess up your cash flow potentially. We haven't seen that too drastically. We've seen a couple little hiccups along the way. For the most part, the intent of it is really to give the chance for the farmers to see what it looks like, to see how it performs. If they wanted to do this on their own, they got to go invest into a piece of equipment. They got to find the time and the labor in the summer to be able to get out there and plant. During that June time frame. So it's eliminating those barriers and working with them to just literally see how feasible this practice even is for working with farmers.
So you're working with the extension service as far as measuring the impact, cost and benefits and those things?
Yeah. We work
So
with
you
them.
are getting some detailed research results?
Yeah, it's part of the on-farm research and the folks that we work with are linked into that system. We went on uses for working with farmers for doing on-farm trials and helping them generate good science out of it. That's why we go out and help them set up the strip trials and make it a replicated study so that it's kind of generating decent science. So it is generating that science. Like I said, it's just a lot of the focus is on, does it work at all? Is it a headache? Cause some sort of those fear issues that you don't foresee when you think, oh, cover crops out there, that's great. And you never know. It's going to happen.
So how do you work around the herbicides?
It's a big piece of this. We hold winter meetings with all the farmers that we work with. We've brought in Chris Proctor from the university, who has a lot of expertise around the different herbicide programs and how they can impact this program. We've absolutely had herbicide interactions where we've gone out, planted the cover crops, and came back later and they're just not there. And we looked back through the herbicide records, and it was because they had put something on in their, even back to the previous year that just had some sort of impact on, these species being able to fight through that and come up. So it's a big change. There's a lot of, it seems as simple as put some cover crops in the ground, but then working it into the whole system and the herbicide program, and fitting it into the right window and not having these other complications is a lot to figure out. So like I said, that's kind of the intent, is work with a small group of farmers on a small amount of land and take some bumps and bruises and see what we learn along the way, and hopefully some of the farmers that we work with will figure out the right way to integrate it into their system and have some success, and then we can leverage those success stories to, if it makes sense, to push the adoption of this other workers.
And we looked at organic.
We do.
Avoid some of the interaction between pesticides.
This field here, nobody beat me up over it, but notice that it's got split row going on. That's actually on an organic field as well too. They did some split row organic on that one. So we did have it within, at least on one farm, and I think they had some success. generally, if the farmer has some foresight, they can still get a herbicide program out there with giants with this. Usually when we've had those failures, it's been because we didn't have a conversation before we did the application, the issue, or they didn't consult and put something on that they didn't realize was going to have that negative effect. So,
The organic food was the main idea to suppress weeds or what's the nature?
I'm trying to think what they specifically were looking at. I don't know, you know, we kind of had them pick between scavenging for nitrogen, weed control, like we gave them a couple different things to potentially focus on, like the mix and with the science that was coming off the project. If I remember right, on the organic farm, they didn't have any like very specific focus. They just kind of wanted to see how it worked out in general. I do think, if I remember right, I do think with that split road, they did have some weed issues with it, just because it was so open and so light. They came in and took out the whole potentially. Not 100% sure. Not 100% sure. So that was our first step into doing soil health work. And that led into what is by far our biggest project so far, that we're calling the Nebraska Soil Carbon Project. This project, how it got started, the Nature Conservancy worked with Cargill, Target, and McDonald's. They contributed, made a large financial commitment to the project that we used as a match to go and apply to the USDA for what's called Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And so that brought a whole bunch of additional funds locally to NRCS for this project. Altogether, we got a budget of a little over $8 million for the next 5 years. Like I said, we're working with our corporate partners, Cargill, McDonald's, and Target, the Central Platte NRD, Upper Big Blue NRD, USD, NRCS, the Nature Conservancy, and then Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, which is a non-profit group that's looking at carbon markets. And the overall goal of the producers is we want to work with producers to install new soil health practices across the central part of the state. Goal would be to work with about 100 producers to get 100,000 acres of soil health practices out on the ground over the next 5 years. And so through the project, farmers can get financial and technical assistance for free practices, cover crops, no-till, and diversifying their crop rotation. Jeez, I might be running along here.
So is the goal for this to like just for increase in soil health, or is it for like trying to reduce carbon emissions? Like, or is it all the above?
Kind of all of the above. Basically, the reason we're doing this project, why we're doing it, farmers, soil health practices benefit the farmer, they also benefit conservation, they can increase the productivity and resiliency of the farm, of the field. They also can generate ecosystem benefits like storing carbon. And there's all this action within these developing carbon market space. And we think that could potentially be a driver and also be reward farmers for the good things that they do on their fields that provide benefits to society as a whole. And then you have private companies that are looking for ways to support farmers and also reach their sustainability goals. And so with this project, to answer your question, we got that financial assistance, technical assistance. There's actually 2 components of this project. So there's the RCPP, which is the public funds that come in. It's basically very similar to like an EQIP program. In fact, it works pretty much exactly the same way. But the RCPP just brings in this whole extra pot of funds specifically for soil health practices, specifically within the boundaries of the 2 NRDs. So it's a big extra pot of funds that's there for helping farmers, giving them financial assistance for implementing the practices on their farm. And then there's a second portion of the project that's the ESMC carbon market pilot project. And an ESMC, just to explain who they are, they're a nonprofit group that's working on a carbon market platform that's really farmer focused. The reasons we're working with ESMC on this is that we see a lot of uncertainty within the carbon market space. Two of the big ones that ESMC structure really helps us out with. One is there's uncertainty around how much carbon can be stored. There's uncertainty around what the value of that carbon is going to be. And so working with ESMC, we can set up a structure where we actually pay for participation and pay for the practice instead of paying for performance. So the folks that we work with, if they participate and have the practice in the ground, they can get a per acre payment of $3 per acre per year, but it's not tied to any sort of outcome. You don't have to store carbon, it's just for participating in the project. And then the other thing that's nice about ESMC is that a lot of the platforms that are out there have pretty long-term commitments currently, and with ESMC it's just an annual contract. So by working through the pilot, each year the farmer can make the decision on whether they want to continue with the project or not. ESMC is working towards a fully functioning platform, and when that platform comes to be, then that farmer, the participant would also have the option annually of whether they want to stay in the pilot and receive the flat rate, or whether they want to move into the market and market their carbon credits and get paid market value. So two of those things that we kind of see risky about carbon markets, we think are less risky by working through this nonprofit ESMC part of the project. So there's the two different parts. There's the RCPP that's very focused on getting practices out on the ground, providing incentives to the producers to get the practices on the ground. And then the ESMC, the intent of that is really to provide farmers an opportunity to work through the pilot in a low risk situation and see what the soil carbon capacity of the fields might actually be, and then additionally have a courtside seat for the next 5 years as these markets develop, so that hopefully by the time they get through working with us on the pilot project, they understand their potential and maybe have a better idea of how these carbon markets are going to work and how they might be able to leverage them in their own operation. So it's kind of coming at it from both ways. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it just seems kind of, I guess, I don't know, it just kind of seems counterproductive, whereas like you want people to do these practices, but all these practices require multiple more trips like over the field, which is, and you're going to get on more carbon because on more tractors and it's less, it would make mine like less major, just like how you're just having to spend more time, more trips over the field, more gas being burned. And to me, that just seems very I guess intuitive.
I think I'm not an expert in this space, but I think those things are accounted for generally within the overall balance of greenhouse gas within ag and how these practices change. But it's something that they keep an eye on for sure. Looking at what's the word I'm looking for the unintended consequences of implementing cover crops and thinking like cover crops, great, we're storing carbon, and so that's like this big win. And ignoring, like you said, that it may mean more trips across the field. It may mean a bigger footprint in another way. So a lot of that stuff's being figured out by people that are smart about the field. So, but I think overall the balance of it for implementing the cover crops ends up positively encountering for those other practices or those other drawbacks that come into play from implementing the practice as a whole. Okay.
Can I add something? So obviously it's going to depend a lot on where you implement this practice, right? With the type of soil implemented. For example, when ESMC estimates the emissions, it's going to
They need to be done now.
emissions. It's not just because they want this is the last time it's just right? So it's not like the net emissions. You can see, okay, it's positive, it's negative, and that's how they do it. And there's like soil sampling going on, so farmers get like free soil sampling and testing. It's at the beginning of the project, so you know how much carbon you have in the ground, what's going on there. nitrogen as we mentioned as well. And from that, we use modeling to estimate the overall GHG. So then you know, hey, it's positive, it's negative. But usually these practices are promoted these because at the end, the net value is usually positive.
The platforms that we've used, even in the past, and that we'll use for the ESMC portion of this, when they go through and look at like the farmer's operation, they don't just look at it and say cover crops are there and it generates this benefit. They actually look at like the whole production system. And so they track trips across the field for tillage, for herbicide, for all these different activities that go on to look at the farming system as a whole, I guess, and what its outcome generally is. I'm being told I'm running short on time, so I'm going to blare through stuff here real quick. But basically from this project, they said there's financial incentives available, technical assistance. We like to give an opportunity to folks that we work with to share their story. We think that that's something important. Usually a lot of the conversations around farmers come from an urban angle with folks that are completely different, disconnected from ag. So we like to give them that chance. Floor mentioned, the detailed report, the soil sampling, plenty of trading and opportunities, and then, like I said, a connection to the emerging carbon markets to see how they might potentially fit in. As far as what's expected from them, the enrollment is for new practices only. There is a little bit of flexibility there if you're making a measurable improvement. From the RCPP side of things, it is an NRCS process, so acknowledgement that it goes through a ranking criteria and a competitive process and uses their whole system for being involved with that. The NRCS piece as well is strictly limited to the boundaries of the 2 MRVs. And from the ESMC side of things, it's a little more flexible in those 2 regards, but the ad there is that by participating in the market pilot, that we need to collect agronomic information to be able to track the success. We've gone through 1 year of enrollment on this. We ended up with about 5,000 acres of practices this fall, but those are spread out over contracts that last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So in total, we funded a little over 23,000 acres of soil health practices during the first increment. I was working with 20 farmers, 7 of them from Upper Big Blue and 13 from the Central Platte NRD. As far as getting involved, for the NRCS side of things, you can apply year-round. Working with the NRCS office is the key. They're the experts on this and understand all their programs and how they can walk a producer through getting involved. We do have a deadline coming up of December 17th this month. That would be for this upcoming season's practice. But like I said, in general, you can also apply anytime year-round. It's just when you're in the cycle of NRCS funding and when that would actually play out. So for the ESMC side of things, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before, you can do either or of these. Like, you don't have to do both. You could do NRCS portion and not sign up for ESMC, or if you don't want to do NRCS funds, you can just sign up for the ESMC piece. If you're interested in the ESMC piece, we have a contact form online. If you enter information in, that puts you in contact with Floor and I, so we can follow up and provide information on enrolling in the ESMC portion of the project. Here's kind of some of the main contacts. We have Courtney Widdop that works out of the Central Platte NRD. John Bush from Upper Big Blue NRD. He's here today, wandering around somewhere. Floor and myself from the Nature Conservancy, and then Josh Bowers and Joe Krolikowski from NRCS as district conservationists that help us support the project. So I have business cards. I'd be glad to give you one if you want to follow up and beat me up or ask questions, complain, whatever you see fit. So I really appreciate you coming and listening to me read along for a little bit. I'll be hanging out, so if you got questions afterwards, feel free to hunt me down.